Welcome back to another episode of the Max Turn Podcast. Kyle Stitch here alongside James Finch. And today we are continuing talking about our recently released contract projections. I kind of paused there because I'm thinking in my head, how recent have we released them? But I think recent still applies. So anyways, those can be found on X at AFP Analytics is where we have those. They're the pinned tweet. You can't miss them if you go to the at AFP Analytics profile. Appreciate everyone engaging. We've had some really nice conversations. We really appreciate people using them, referencing. If you are interested in using them in article referencing, etc., we have a little information on how we just appreciate being cited, but you are absolutely free to do so. And again, we do appreciate people sharing and feedback and all that stuff. So today, again, is a little bit more about the contract projections. We talked about the unrestricted free agent market in our last episode that we kind of released in tandem with the projections. So today makes sense to talk about the restricted free agents. So we were debating before we started recording what order we wanted to go in, and we decided let's just have a conversation on players, probably start towards the top and then kind of see how we want the conversation to go from there. So any questions, any thoughts on restricted free agents? I think there's some names that we've seen a lot of kind of engagement with on X already, as far as like fans thinking, trying to maneuver, wondering how their team's going to fit them. So there's some names that should be a very good discussion here. So any questions at AFP Analytics on X, Max Turn Podcast available on pretty much all major platforms. And with that, let's get into it. James was the one a little more responsible for running the restricted free agents. So he was the one who kind of figured out long-term, short-term deal for a lot of these. So why don't we start first by explaining why we have long-term and short-term deals for a lot of these players? Let's start there before we dive into things.
I think that's definitely good to do, and it almost helps explain our inability to decide on an order here. So RFA, restricted free agent, means that while they may be able to have discussions with other teams, their own team has the right to match any type of offer, and in an overwhelming majority of cases, there is no contract agreed upon with a different team, even though we love offer sheets. So that's a big factor here. The other factor is, I guess, call it the RFA timeline. Guys who are closer to UFA, you need to be mindful of certain contract lengths that could potentially walk them right to unrestricted free agency. Then you also need to consider if you start adding unrestricted years to the contract, there's a different value there. And also when you're looking at two different players, and I guess we can give an example pretty quickly. Let's say Seth Jarvis, who's going to be going into, well, he'll be 22 on July 1st. And then you have a Martin Necas, who's 25 July 1st. So you're looking at one player who's coming off his ELC in Jarvis, and you're looking at another who isn't. One's a lot closer to unrestricted free agency, the other's not. So even though guys like that could be not a comparable, but it's worth discussing them at the same time because they are on the same team right now, they don't actually really compare situationally.
So ELC entry-level contract, that's the standard first contract that all players sign, generally 3 years. Occasionally, if they're coming out of college or signing late or something, could be 2, could be 1. Generally, what applies to more people who are coming over from Europe. And to kind of make it simple, if you want to purchase unrestricted free agent years, you have to make it worth the player's time to basically forego the right to talk to other teams. So if you want, you kind of have to show them the money to kind of forego the right to talk to other teams as an unrestricted free agent. And then there's also restricted free agents with and without arbitration rights, We did a detailed episode on arbitration last summer, so if you kind of scroll back a ways in our episodes, you should be able to find a bigger breakdown. So I don't think we get in here. Maybe we'll link it below or something as a separate, so kind of some background listening if you're interested. So anyways, I think that's a good background. If you have questions on restricted free agency, so restricted free agency players aren't eligible for unrestricted free agency until age 27 or 7 years in the league, basically. So with most players starting in the league around 20 years old, they kind of simultaneously hit 27 and 7 years. So any other questions, feel free to ask, again, at AFP Analytics on X. So with that background, now I think we get into it. Starting towards the top, I think. Should we start right at the top, or should we continue with that Jarvis and Necas kind of discussion?
I guess we can continue with it since I brought it up. Between the two, I think for Carolina's sake, Jarvis is viewed as the better player. And I think he's also viewed as more of a long-term piece for the team, part of their core. I always mess up his name. Is it Necas or Necas?
I think I've heard both ways.
Okay.
So apologies, Martin Necas or Necas, if you are listening. We do apologize.
Yeah,
I'm sure you're listening to this
for
episode.
For sure. He's the one that's really in the news right now as far as rumors possibly being traded. So I think a big part of that is because of where he's at from a contract standpoint. So he's arbitration eligible, and he's pretty much in a spot where you could sign a bridge deal, which would most likely be something that will result in him being an unrestricted free agent at the end of it, but still buy a few years, I believe. Let me see.
I think it would buy our projection. I think would buy one unrestricted year.
One unrestricted year. Our short-term projection is a 3-year deal, though. So that deal came in at about 6.2 per year. Solid money for call him a second line winger, maybe a center, as of right now. Long term, so now we need to consider we're essentially purchasing unrestricted free agent years from the player. Like you said, you're pretty much needing to convince him to not want to hit unrestricted free agency soon. So that deal was a 7-year contract for about $7.5 million a year. So price goes up a little bit because you're buying those UFA years. This is an interesting one because I feel like there's a lot going on with Carolina as a team. Don Waddell's gone. Pretty much getting to a point with Necas that if he's looking for a bigger role, I don't think it's really how they view him. So it's, do you go short term, do you go long term, or do you potentially trade the player, which is why he's in all the rumors. Seth Jarvis, on the other hand, younger player coming off his ELC. This was an interesting one. So if he were to do a short-term deal or a bridge deal, you're pretty much signing him to a contract so you can keep him as a restricted free agent when the contract's over. So you could do that with a 3-year deal, which is what we have projected at about $6.3 million AAV. And then a long-term deal, we have 7 years at about 7.9, and I believe that would buy, 2 unrestricted years for Jarvis. It might be 3.
I believe it would be 3. Since he's already played 3 years in the league, he would have 4 until he would become an unrestricted free agent, which would mean a 7-year deal would buy 3 years of unrestricted free agency.
Yep, that would be a good thing to add to our sheet, actually. But
yeah. I'm as we're going, I'm kind of looking at hiding some columns because we do have a lot of things in our sheet. But yeah. I think there is one scenario where if Carolina kind of wants to run it back, try their best to run it back. They can play. I mean, they can play hardball with both players.
Yeah.
Actually, taking Martin Necas to arbitration would be probably the easiest way for them to suppress his salary. Like, he's not going to get a massive arbitration award, I don't think. But that really is going to spell the end of that relationship. So the award, there's a lot of factors that, depending on who files and who requests the length and stuff, the award could either be a 1-year award or a 2-year award. And then once the player files for, or team files for arbitration, no more offer sheets. So it's a very complicated thing without knowing more facts right this minute. But there's a scenario where Carolina could end up with a 1-year deal or a 2-year deal for Necas given by an arbitrator that would definitely suppress the salary. So I would say it maybe isn't cutting what we have as our short-term projection in half, but it's probably not far from that. I would be shocked if it would be over $4 million. So if Carolina's looking to run it back, save some cap space, and just kind of exhaust what they can out of Necas value-wise, arbitration could be an option there. I don't think it's the smart option because it is kind of after 2 years you're done. You're not coming back from going that route basically.
Yeah. So that's definitely one to watch. And I will say, as far as the RFA market, he's kind of by himself as far as where he is in that RFA timeline for his position. There's quite a bit of separation to get to another player. So I see you moving down the spreadsheet to a player, and I guess I'll bring him up. So Casey Mittelstadt, probably viewed as more of a legitimate center at this point, where Necas is he was pretty much a winger for Carolina. Maybe a team thinks they could put him down the middle and make it work, but that's a little more up in the air. I think Mittelstadt is probably really the closest comparable this offseason as a restricted free agent of someone who could maybe help increase or lower the value a little bit. There's also Barrett Hayton, but again, more of a true center. So how much does that really impact Necas? I don't know. And
Hayton will be a year younger, kind of. So that does matter because a 1 or 2 year arbitration award is different for Barrett Hayton than it is in terms of where it takes some contract situation at the end of it than it would be for a Necas or Mittelstadt. So Mittelstadt and Necas are probably the two forwards where there's a wide range of outcomes. If both of their teams want to play hardball, try to suppress the salary the best they can, there's routes to do it. The minute you go that route with either of those players, though, is probably the end of that relationship when that contract's up. You don't do that and generally have a long-term kind of situation work out. So I think Mittelstadt, we'll talk about him for a minute and then we'll kind of jump back up to the top. Mittelstadt has been a great fit in Colorado. Came on the last year and a half as well in Buffalo, or season and a half, maybe, however you want to say that. The potential was always there, but the production wasn't matching it. And now he has ascended to be a true, really good 2C. He would be probably a 1C on some teams, not great teams, but some teams. But he's
a top 6 center.
Exactly. He's exactly what Colorado needed. Colorado's going to have a pretty tough time suppressing that salary because arbitration's all about just making an argument for why the player deserves less. They also gave up a very valuable asset to get him. So, and he was just so good, and he fills a clear need. So I actually like our projection for Mittelstadt. It gives him a few less years than Necas, so it would give him. So we have 5 years by basically $6 million. We'll just round it. So $30 million, 5 years, $6 million average annual value. That feels like a really good deal for both sides. And hey, and then Mittelstadt would get another crack at the kind of free agency at a young enough age where he could still get another very nice contract.
Oh yeah, so if he continues to play the way he did towards the end for Buffalo and then with Colorado, yeah, he would around age 30 be able to cash in. So you mentioned the long-term situation for him. Short-term, our projection is pretty much a 1-year deal, which could end up being arbitration if they went that route, which for Colorado, cap space might be a little iffy depending on some other moves they try and do. So they could look to do a 1-year deal. If I had to bet on it, I think they get a long-term deal done, though, with Mittelstadt. But just for the purpose of the conversation, 1 year, 4.5.
One other thing that we have is kind of in the spreadsheet with the contract projections are comparable players. If you scroll far right, you have to go quite right to find them. But I really like the JT Miller comp situationally. I think play style wise they're not exactly the same, but situationally kind of bounced a little bit, took a little while to latch on, but had showed flashes.
New York to Tampa Bay, so he ends up signing a 5-year deal with Tampa Bay, just to give a little more context.
And that carried a 6.6 cap hit percentage, and we have Mittelstadt sliding just above that cap hit percentage wise. So to me, that makes that comp has always made a lot of sense. And I mean, the other ones that we have on kind of the high end, William Karlsson and Anthony Cirelli, both really good, like 2Cs. I know Karlsson at the time he signed was probably Vegas's 1C, but really more of a 2C. So those are 3 really good comps, I think, on the high end. And then Yanni Gourde and Marcus Johansson on the lower end. I mean, I think Mittelstadt's clearly better than Johansson, but Johansson's the kind of low end comp.
Yeah.
Gourde, I would rather have Mittelstadt because he brings a little more offense, but it's also not a bad comp either because Mittelstadt has sneakily developed a good 2-way game himself. So the Mittelstadt projection, I feel it's great, and I think Colorado would be very wise to make that work.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think there's probably you want to make sure you have your 2 top centers locked up as probably 2 out of a handful of positions, call it, or spots in the lineup that you want to make sure you have your core locked up, and your 2C is generally part of your core. And with how well things went for Mittelstadt, it kind of seems like a no-brainer to make sure you get that done and not leave it up to chance. If you go the 1-year route and he keeps doing well or even improves on what he did this past season, all of a sudden going to have to pay him even more. So it would make a lot of sense to get that deal locked in.
So I think that segues back well to Jarvis versus Necas, like getting that long-term deal done, not wanting to risk even better performance. I think that's exactly what Carolina needs to do with at least Seth Jarvis, because I think that almost needs to be priority number 1. I know you can save money on a short-term deal with Jarvis, but that's a short-term savings. And you kick that can a couple more years down the road, and he's like your elite first-line winger, center, whatever he's playing at that point. Probably he's pretty much been a wing, but if he's taking first-line minutes and, you know, elite 2-way player, which you wouldn't expect anything less, that contract in a couple years, especially with the rising cap, this might sound insane, but it's probably pushing $9 to $10 million.
I would think so. I mean, if you look at other first line caliber players who around, let's say, age 25, 26, that's very, I would almost argue that would be right now reasonable if he was at that age. So, yeah, in a few years with the cap rising, it could be roughly 12 million higher than it is now. There's going to be quite a bump in salary, assuming he stays the same player or gets even better.
I think there's a good example for fans who kind of want to wrap their head around like why we're saying Carolina really should make the space to make this happen now. Look at Sam Reinhart in Florida right now. He has been on short-term deal after short-term deal, Sabres, then Panthers. So Carolina could try and do the exact same thing with Seth Jarvis. Reinhart, if he hits the open market, basically unless he takes like either a tax discount or a true discount to stay in Florida, I mean, we have him projected over $11 million, and I mean that's pretty unanimous across the like projection board, like high 10s, low 11s. Like there's just, that's what you're looking at if you stretch a player like a Seth Jarvis out. So this is why, or you can have under contract for under $8 million for a few of those unrestricted free agent years. You tell me what you want as a fan listening.
At that point is very valuable, especially if you're a team like Carolina who is going to have, I believe it's around 26.5 mil in cap space. There's going to be a lot going on in Carolina, so there's more to their offseason than just these two players we've been talking about, but they have the ability to make it work now, so they probably should. There's also a article that was written how many years ago? Do you want to say that article?
Kind of explaining 2018, 2019. Yeah, I think 2018.
And we've talked about it before last offseason because these same situations pop up every year. But
I did the math that however many years ago, me and a colleague, you can see the colleague's name. I'll let you find it. Basically did a research over the summer about why bridge deals don't make sense in hockey. Why these short-term deals don't make sense math-wise. And I mean, I'm not going to take all the credit, but since I presented that article, there's been a lot less short-term deals in hockey. But math-wise, and now that we're back to a cap that should rise consistently,
it makes even more sense.
Yes. So the math is there. Maybe we'll also attach the article to this, but the article is called "Burn the Bridge." Dear NHL teams, burn the bridge deal. AFP Analytics. Type that right into Google; it'll come right up for you. Presented at RIT Sport Analytic Conference, so it's been kind of vetted and like legitimate. So just for reference and everything.
I think that's important too. So we have for a lot of the RFAs, and certainly the top ones, I guess I should say, we have a long term and a short term because that's it happens. Teams go short term bridge deal, but for probably I'll say 90%, but it could be a little more, a little less, depending on the year. For 90% of the players, if you were to ask us, we're probably telling you to sign the long term, don't do the short term. And the other 10% being just weird one-off specific situations.
We're still having flashbacks to last offseason with Cole Caulfield, is where like there's no way Montreal is going to give him a long-term contract. So let's just predict the short term.
Big knee injury, yep, and he did. So
yeah, so we're every player who's anyone now gets a short and long term, and that was like one of our biggest misses last year. And I mean, it was what it was. We just didn't see Montreal doing it, even though it was the smart thing to do.
Yeah,
and they did give him the long-term contract. So stick with another player where the team would be very wise to get that long-term contract done now, no matter what it's going to take. And there's a couple players that fall under this. I'm going to go Quentin Byfield next. Actually, let's talk about both Quentin Byfield and Lucas Raymond. We'll stick with forwards. Then we'll get to another Detroit player in a little while, Mo Seider on defense. But let's stick with forwards. Raymond and Byfield are probably the two other biggest names. There's other ones for sure, but let's spend a little bit on them because those are both guys that their teams really need to pay now.
Yeah.
Than kicking that can down the road.
Yeah, so I'll start with Raymond because we have him slightly higher with his long-term deal. So 7 by 7.7. So that is long-term, and then short-term we have 3 by 6.1 or 6.2, kind of splitting the middle. So like you said, these are two players who are pretty much at this point, they're already a top-of-the-lineup player. And it fits right into the discussion we just had of you can go long-term, and it's going to be at a bit of a lower number now because there's still a handful of RFA years in that contract, where if you went bridge and you push it down the road, you're probably looking at a much larger long-term deal. So Lucas Raymond, I would say pretty much had a breakout year, and it's what's expected of him, so I would expect that to continue. With Detroit, I believe they aren't in the greatest. Well, actually, they are. They've got quite a bit of cap space, 29. And I think it popped into my head that they aren't in the greatest.
They're not. They don't have the situation.
Yeah. But it's because they have some of these bigger named RFAs that they need to get done. So that amount of cap space, it's not going to dry up, but it should be significantly smaller.
Yeah, should was going to be the word I was going to use there.
Yeah.
Is that should be probably cut in half.
Yes.
Very with two deals.
Yeah, with Raymond being one of them. So just like we previously discussed, same exact situation. There is a short-term deal projected. It makes too much sense, really, to do the long-term deal. So that was 7 by 7.7. Interesting one, even more so to me, is Byfield, because here's a top draft pick billed as a center who so far has played the majority of his time on the wing.
But the question is that based on who LA has?
Yes.
Or is it based on where they think he's performance-wise better?
So I'm going to say I believe it's because of who else they have.
I would agree.
Which brings me to the next thought of go long-term now while he's a good winger. Because if you go short-term, so to give you the numbers, Byfield long-term we have at 7 by 7.4 right now. And then short-term,
I think it was like 3.5 or something along those 1 year. 3.5. It's down a little ways.
To 3.8. So yeah, the risk in going short term is that you end up needing him at center, and he looks pretty much like the exact same player he is on the wing, but at center. And if that's the case, his value is going to shoot through the roof because he's older. You're going to need to buy more UFA years, and he's at a premium position. So that is one where the Kings absolutely need to go long-term. I have a little bit of a worry that they are not going to, because ultimately an underwhelming year for the Kings. They have 19.9 in cap space, which sounds like a lot. They need a number one goalie. They're losing a player like Matt Roy, Victor Arvidsson. So there's going to be some other fairly significant holes to fill with that 19.9. Byfield needs a deal. Looking down the list, like a Jordan Spence, shouldn't break the bank, but it's going to add up when you consider all of these other needs. It worries me they're going to go short term to fill all of those other needs.
Yeah, I kind of have the exact same thought because you look at, Anze Kopitar is signed for 2 more years. So let's sign Byfield for 2 years and then we'll get a deal done and he'll be the kind of 1 or 2C of the future. That's probably the most flawed logic you can come up with, because the minute you kick the can to the end of Kopitar's deal and he's either slotted to play center or has played a year of center, you've just driven up your own price tag to astronomical rates, whereas right now you can kind of cash in and keep that deal low.
So that's the other factor here is a team that ultimately underperformed, who is going to look to pretty much contend for a cup next year with potentially jobs on the line, especially for their GM. Chances are, I shouldn't say chances are, but it might be much more attractive to them in that front office to go short term so that they can right now field or ice the best team possible. So kicking the can down the road for Rob Blake as GM, it's either not going to matter to him because he's not going to be there anymore, or he's still there, which means things went pretty well this upcoming season and you deal with it because things went well and you still have your job.
Our discussion is leading me to think that Byfield would be a perfect offer sheet person.
So looking at just the restricted free agents, yeah, you could name Mo Seider or a Seth Jarvis, but those are teams that can for sure fit those contracts. Again, the cap situation, we just laid out all the needs. I 100% agree. If I was a team looking for a top talent this offseason through offer sheets, Byfield.
So the other reason I lay that out is those other players, I think the kind of the current teams would see the value in the long term, potentially see the value in a long-term contract. If some team were to come in and offer sheet Byfield, pay him like a 1C, the Kings might not. They probably understand that there is that potential value, but they might not be putting the same offer on the table. So it takes two to tango with an offer sheet. So a team, first off, has to be willing, which hasn't always been the case. Then the player has to be willing to sign it. If you were to dangle more money in front of Quentin Byfield because you view him, and a bigger role because you view him that way, he might bite for that, because he's also going to still be stuck for 2 years in LA as potentially a winger. The best thing for his career would be to move to 1 or 2C on a different team.
There's one team, not to go too far down this road, but there's one specific team this offseason that I think would absolutely do an offer sheet, and you're going to love it. The
Utah Yotes?
Yep. Lots and lots of cap space. Just over $43 million. New ownership that wants to make a splash or 2 or 3 this offseason, and they are also a pretty solid team. They were right on the edge of the playoffs for majority of the year. Pretty much every checkbox of should we do an offer sheet, they check it.
And loaded with picks.
Yes.
And prospects.
Yep. It would make a lot of sense to do that. I would almost say I'd love to see it because we love the team building chaos like that. So
Ryan Smith, I know you're also listening, so do it. Do the offer sheet.
Honestly, he's probably a step ahead of us already. So,
yeah. He's probably already got it locked up in a safe, ready
yep.
to
Contracts
send out on July
drawn up
1st.
already.
Yeah. Anyways, so I think we've hit a lot of the big forward names. Maybe one more forward name, 1 or 2 more. Matty Beniers would be I think one that I'd be interested to spend a minute or two talking about. I think Dawson Mercer a lot. We said with Lucas Raymond's kind of the same. He's a little bit lower quality, but like they're in the same category as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Matty Beniers would be the one that I would talk about for a minute because he took the league by storm. Really, really good when he came in. Kind of dropped off. I don't know if he's a 1C or I don't know if he's a 1C on a good team.
Part of that, I think, going back to his draft year with Byfield was kind of viewed as the top guy.
They were subsequent drafts.
Were they?
Yeah. Lafreniere, Byfield were 1 and 2.
Oh, it was Lafreniere. Byfield.
Power, Beniers.
That's right. Okay, so Power ended up going. Beniers, I want to say, was at that point even viewed as a top 6 for sure, but not a guaranteed one. He did drop off this year. A lot of Seattle did, which is kind of to play devil's advocate. I don't know if, like, how Seattle would view his drop off, if it is as drastic as it looks to us on the outside, or if they kind of say, well, you know what, a lot of our team struggled offensively. So that when I mentioned 90%, we would recommend long-term 10%. The question is he part of that 10%? Is he one of those players? And from a long-term standpoint, our deal 7 years at about 6.6, that might be worth the risk still, especially with the cap rising. It's probably going to take a couple years, but in a couple of years, there's going to be 3Cs making $6 million. So that might be a good risk to take, that he rebounds and keeps improving and becomes a 1C or an elite 2C, and you have him on a great deal. But there might be a little hesitancy there.
I think the question you asked is, was it just a down year because of the team and everything? I think if Seattle feels that answer is yes, they absolutely should be trying to get a long-term contract done, because then they're expecting him to get better.
Yes.
If they think that he's peaked, plateaued already, yeah, maybe kicking the can down the road with him is fine, because it's probably not going to go up a ton. It's going to go up a little bit because of a higher cap, but you probably, if he is plateaued, this $6 to $7 million contract is probably what he's still getting in a couple years.
Yeah, with maybe a little bit of an increase, but not significant.
So I think the question you started Beniers with, was this a team issue or is this a player issue? If the management views it as a team issue, they should try and capitalize on his down year and go and try and get him to a cheaper long-term contract. If they view it as a player they probably should consider a short-term deal. It always takes two sides here to tango. If Beniers knows that, hey, this is going to go better next year, I don't know if he signs up for a long-term contract because he knows he's in line for a payday in the future.
That's true, and I think that's something a lot of people tend to not think about or forget about, is because everyone's looking through the lens of what their favorite team is going to do, but it takes two to tango. Seattle's not writing in the numbers on the contract that's already got Beniers' signature on it. It's a negotiation. So, yeah, he could for sure kind of walk in saying, well, no, it's for sure a short-term deal, and they end up 2 to 3 years, which our projections 3 years at about 4.1. So still solid deal, and yeah, we'll see. But that's definitely one that's a bit more unclear than some of the other names we've talked about.
Basically, the way that a player like Beniers gets leverage in this situation is by taking the long-term deal off the table. So he loses short-term leverage, but he kind of gains long-term negotiating leverage
Yes.
by not being willing to sign this 7-year, $6.6 million contract, which if I'm advising him, frankly, I'm not, on the player side, I'm not advising him to sign this.
Which I will say that almost brings up an interesting conversation. It could be a short one just about our contracts. And almost, I guess, a reminder where we get to the number we get to using comparable players. And I think it's kind of important to highlight that even though we might have a player projected at a number, it's not us saying like, yeah, go sign that, both to the team or the player. It's not us saying go and sign that. It's just that's what we kind of believe to be the long-term value for this player. Here's what we believe to be the short-term value, where, again, 90% of the time, give or take, we're pretty much on board long-term all the way. Specific situations, maybe short-term makes more sense, whether it's the team or the player.
Yeah, so if you're like Beniers' agent and Seattle comes at you with an offer of like 7 years, $7.5 million, you sign that.
Yeah.
Because that's well above what we think his kind of value is. I'm not saying our projections are be all end all, but they're kind of a guideline for where it should sit.
Yeah.
But if they're talking like 7 years under, or 6 years, 7 years under $7 million, you might want to pump the brakes there.
Which could very well be what they're looking at.
Yeah. So that's kind of how I would read, like, if you're a team agent using these, this is not necessarily what you should be targeting to sign the player for, but it should give you a kind of stepping off point. And if the two sides are in kind of this wheelhouse, it's probably fair for both. But if one side can kind of move one way or the other, that's when it should be an obvious deal to get done, or at least for the one of the sides. So we've spent a lot of time on forwards. Defense, I mean, I guess there's really 3 names on defense at the top.
Yeah.
Very different. I mean, and really 2 big ones, then a third sneaky kind of big one.
Yeah.
Let's start with Mo Seider, because he's kind of actually the unique outlier in the sense that he's the only defenseman coming off his entry-level contract that we have projected a big deal for. And I think, so I think you're the one to talk through this a little bit more. Oh, okay. I guess there's one other name that I've glanced over. So I guess there's 2 in this situation, and then 2 slightly farther down the RFA road that we'll touch on. So I guess 4 guys. Let's start with Seider though, because he is a little bit younger. Actually, no, he's actually older. Jeez. Okay, Seider and Harley. Those are the two young RFAs. I think we need to start off a little bit talking about how the restricted free agent market has changed very recently for these type of players. So these are players that are coming off their entry-level contract. So they've played 3 years in the NHL and now signing their kind of first big real contract, if you will. And I think there's been a dramatic shift over the last couple of years for how teams are approaching kind of these players.
Yeah, so I guess just to start right away with a couple examples. Jake Sanderson in Ottawa, Owen Power in Buffalo. And I guess if you want to go, I think it would be a extra year before, maybe 2 years before Quinn Hughes, I believe, his current deal that he's on.
And then the other 2 going a little farther back, Shabbat and Heiskanen, I think would be the other 2 to kind of lump in there.
Okay, yep, for sure. And so it's pretty much, if they being the team, believe a player to be a top pair defenseman, or I guess not necessarily a franchise guy, but a top pair defenseman, someone capable of playing those minutes, and maybe they already do. It seems like they're wanting to get them under contract long-term right away, which, like you said, and really just the purpose of that article you wrote a handful of years ago. Not originally what teams wanted to do.
No. I mean, especially on defense.
Yes.
Because, and I think this is where hockey's getting a little bit smarter, is, okay, negotiations are still very much based off of the box score type statistics. But that doesn't mean levels of the advanced underlying numbers are not creeping in. Where they're not creeping in is arbitration. But where we're seeing this shift a little bit more dramatically is defensemen. Because defensemen who put up numbers have always gotten paid. See Makar, Cal from Colorado. Fox, Adam from the Rangers. But you look at the Sandersons, the Powers. Teams are starting to realize, I think, that there's other value that, especially with like an Owen Power, that they bring. And that's where this negotiation with Seider is probably going to be headed. Is he does not have the eye-popping box score numbers.
No, and even if you look initially, quick glance at some of the underlying numbers, they're fine, but they aren't amazing. One of the bigger topics with defensemen is, well, who are they playing against? And I think people need to remember, when you're looking at top pair guys who are playing a lot of minutes each night, they're usually matched up against the highest quality that the other team is bringing.
Or they're playing with the lowest quality on their own team.
Also true.
Usually both.
Yeah, usually both. So that is probably one of the best arguments on Seider's side. And like you said, the points aren't there. So projecting this contract was interesting. Long-term, 7 years at about 8.1. I think a lot of people would expect him to come in a bit higher because he's their number one franchise guy. Again, the points weren't really there. Comparables, this kind of puts him in about the same grouping as Owen Power, Jake Sanderson. A little bit under Quinn Hughes in his contract. But right with Owen Power and Jake Sanderson, those are two players who are on teams that already had, in theory, their top number one defenseman and weren't quite necessarily viewed as being leaned on in those really, really, really tough minutes. And again, that's, I think, what Seider's representation would really want to try and drive home, is this guy is your number one franchise defenseman. It's just tough to get him up to Hughes, past Hughes, into the Aaron Ekblad deal because the numbers aren't quite there.
To be a fly on the wall, or just have recordings of these conversations between Yzerman and Seider's representatives would just be fascinating, because the case in Seider's favor is, analytically, there are some very strong. I know Dom from The Athletic had wrote a really good midseason article. I've seen other articles as well that have kind of detailed just how screwed he's kind of been by like his deployment, and yet has still been successful. So there are very strong analytic arguments for Mo Seider to get a very big contract. That's what the agent's going to try and push. But the problem is that would be bringing negotiations to a frontier, especially restricted free agent negotiations. I can tell you this firsthand. That would be really pushing the boundaries of what has traditionally been done. And that's not saying Yzerman and the rest of the front office wouldn't be aware of these arguments, But because they can kind of say, well, that's not how this works, they have the upper hand in this negotiation. They're just going to kind of stick to the traditional box score numbers to try to keep this salary lower. If Seider ends up with a short-term deal, I will not be surprised, because that feels like the kind of the concession by both sides. I think that feels where it ends up. 3 years. Let's get him right to 26 years old. He'll have one more year before restricted free agency. Did you have 3 or 2 years? I might.
3 year.
Yeah. So 3 years,
Yep.
takes him
At
right.
5.4.
That feels like that's very similar to what the Sabres did with Rasmus Dahlin.
So I was waiting to get there, because 4 main comps here: Rasmus Dahlin, Charlie McAvoy, Sergachev with Tampa Bay. What happened with all 3 of those guys?
Paid.
Yep. So they did their bridge deal and afterwards got big contracts. 4th comp. We'll get to this player shortly, and this would be a low-end comp, but I had to throw it in there because Detroit. Philip Hronek. Probably about to get a fairly decent contract. Not top franchise level. Again, this is a low-end comp. But similar situation of, well, he's coming off of a short-term deal now. He's going to get a pretty solid contract. So when kind of some of the main comps are all examples of basically a bridge deal gone wrong, you would hope that kind of sticks out to the team and they go, okay, wait a minute, maybe we should go long-term here. But we'll see. Because this is kind of that interesting in between. He is, with some stats, some of the more advanced ones, a very, very good number 1. It's just those traditional counting stats, points, not quite there yet. So that might be one of the more interesting situations to watch from an RFA perspective this offseason. It wouldn't shock me if it was one of the situations that ends up getting pushed almost towards the fall and takes a while to get done. But with that being said, kind of the next name on the board here for us is Thomas Harley, who I think at the start of the season pretty much, I mean, he was a good prospect, but no one was expecting a whole lot, I think, from him, much more than a bottom pair presence, really. And he ended up having a breakout year and is a very important piece of their playoffs. So to kind of give that contract projection, 7 years at about 6.9, and then we've got a 2-year deal at about $4 million. An interesting one because of where the team is at. Not a ton of cap space. They're going to lose some players. Matt Duchene, Chris Tanev, that's kind of a popular one as far as possibly trying to bring him back. So being able to fit the long-term deal, I think, will be what the question is. Not necessarily is he worth it. So probably being the number 2 on the team, or if not, a very, very good number 3 defenseman, I think that long-term deal would make sense to get done, and then you'd hit the market again right before his age 30 season, I believe. But I also would wonder, with the breakout that he had, this might be another situation where the player would prefer to go short-term and then cash in a couple of years, where honestly Dallas might be better positioned at that point to give out a larger contract, with a Jamie Benn needing a new deal, not necessarily being gone, but it would be much lower. So it might be another one of those situations where it ends up being a short-term deal.
I think the short term also just because he doesn't have a ton of sample to be based on. So one of the concluding points in when I gave this presentation on why teams should go long is actually a smaller sample helps the team. But again, it takes two to tango. The players should know that they are probably heading up, but as you laid out cap wise, short term feels like it makes enough sense. And hey, if they're paying him, have to pay him down the road, they also already have a really good deal done with Rupe Hintz where they're going to have some extra like kind of surplus cap space in the future. And even the same can kind of be said for Heiskanen, although if we kick the Harley can down the road, that he's going to be up for a new contract shortly thereafter. So I agree with you. I would not be this. So both of our top kind of young defensemen here, I would not be shocked to see either of them get short-term deals. I think Detroit would be not smart at all. I was going to use stronger words, but we'll just say not smart at all to go short-term. Dallas, I can see the argument for going short-term. So I think that's kind of where those two guys fall for me. So let's talk about two more kind of. So these are the older RFAs. So these are the ones with arbitration rights, a lot closer to unrestricted free agency. And so that means their long and short-term projections are closer because both are buying unrestricted free agent years. And both, I think, are represented by the same agent. Fun fact. Pretty sure that's the case. And both have their kind of positives and negatives, pros, cons that we can kind of lay out. So Philip Hronek, Sean Durzai. Hronek just finished having a really good first half with Vancouver. Really poor second half.
And playoffs.
And then an even probably weaker playoffs. A lot of Vancouver fans seem ready to move on if there's a trade or something to be had. Meanwhile, Sean Durzai never really had a big role in LA, was kind of down on the depth chart, but was really, really good when given more of an opportunity in Arizona. And now with Utah looking to kind of build a foundation, he would be a smart piece for them to lock up to a long-term contract to start building some sort of defensive core because they don't have like anyone locked up in that lineup, at least on the blue line.
Yeah, so that's the thing with Durzai. He's not probably, if they were to fill out their roster in a way that they'd want to be a legitimate championship contender, Durzai he's maybe on your top pair, but could also very well be a second pair guy, a good second pair defenseman. So our long-term deal for Durzai is a 5-year deal at $6 million. And short-term is a 1 year at 4.7. I pretty much believe there's almost no reason that Utah should be looking to go short-term. And again, tons of cap space. I believe it was like $43 million. He's their best defenseman right now, and it would just make sense pretty much in every way you want to look at it to lock him up long-term. That's kind of the easy one for me here. Tougher one is Hronek because of the high of we just found our Quinn Hughes partner. He's a top pair defenseman. He looks amazing. To, in a snap of a finger, pretty much, wait a minute, is this the same player from the first half? I've seen some Canucks fans, media point out, and I think this is smart to do, that, okay, he had a pretty poor second half, playoffs wasn't very good. Be careful possibly giving up on what was a top pair defenseman, especially a right shot. not easy to find. But you also need to factor in what happened this year. So it's not an easy thing to really look at and decide. We have a long-term deal at 7 years, about $7.5 million. That could end up being a deal. If he's more the player he was in the first half, that would be a pretty good deal for the team. If he's more the player he was in the second half in the playoffs, that could actually be a pretty tough deal for the team. Looking short term, 3 years, 6.1. So this is a short-term deal. He would be a UFA at the end of it. It buys 2 UFA years. In a way, it feels like the safe option. But if he's the player he was in the first half at the end of this deal, your top pair right shot defenseman is going to be looking at, honestly, if he is that player from the first half for 3 more seasons, he will get 10 plus. Very significant jump. So another very tough one to really gauge, and it might be so tough that the team kind of punts the decision to a different team and trades him.
So I think for a level of context, the best right shot defenseman we have available is Brandon Montour, who's 30 years old. We have, I believe, a 7-year deal, like $7.7 million cap hit. Maybe 6 years. I forget where we settled there. So, I mean, in theory, cap hit wise, you could replace him with probably an equivalent, maybe a slight upgrade, definitely different style player, which might be fine for the short term. But when Brandon Montour is in his late 30s, or when you would much rather have a Philip Hronek who's in his early 30s, I would imagine.
And insert Brett Pesce, Matt Roy, some of the other next tier, but other right shots.
Dylan DeMello would be probably the other one.
Tanev is being talked a lot about, and that's completely different, much older player. Still very solid, but you see these age issues popping up with all of these other options for the most part.
And that's not to say that, like, if there's a trade to be had, great. But other teams also saw the same kind of thing in the second half of the season in playoffs, and they're probably not going to be offering they're not going to be offering first half Hronek prices. So you might be best off as Vancouver to try to leverage all that into getting him on a value contract, opposed to kind of selling low on the asset, basically.
Yeah, I think the interesting one that's been interesting trade idea that's been thrown around a lot publicly was Hronek for Necas with Carolina. That being sort of a similar situation where it seems like it just might be time for the team and player to move on. And I think that's just a very popular trade package that's being thrown out right now because both players are being talked about a lot right now. And in theory, the fits might work.
And that's what we call a good teaser. Because our next episode,
hang on, we got one more player we should probably talk about.
We'll get the teaser and subscribe to Max Turn Podcast because the next episode we have planned is kind of looking at Vancouver. Will be the primary focus. We might kind of talk about some other teams that have a lot of decisions to be made, a lot of potential moving parts. But we will probably dive into a little bit more of the Hronek Necas deal in the next episode. Subscribe Max Turn Podcast. But before we wrap it up, one more defenseman you wanted to hit on. I might have glanced over the name, but
goalie.
Okay. Yeah, duh. Goalie. I didn't glance over a defenseman.
Swayman. So just right off the bat, I'm going to say did we end up including a short term for
We did
Swayman?
not. No.
I don't think we did because it doesn't make any sense. Interesting thing is the long-term contract trying to find the right number. So Swayman, obviously the past 2 years has been a very good goalie. And then he just had a great playoff stretch. Pretty clear that he's the number one of the future in Boston. So a lot of people are throwing out things like, well, what about like 8x8? Or would it be 8x8.5? And I almost sit here saying, maybe. Like, that's not out of the question. Getting to that number with a projection, at least the way we do our projections with comparable players, very tough to do so. So our long-term deal ended up being a 5-year contract at 6.4. Now, to walk through some of the comps that we had, looking at John Gibson, Connor Hellebuck, kind of at the high end. Then low end, Shesterkin, Demko, Saros. Now, when I'm thinking of players, and this might just be because they're some of the more recent guys, I think of Swayman as being in that Shesterkin, Demko, Saros group. Big part of that is he wasn't a obvious starter, clear number one as far as games played. He was splitting time with Ullmark. So in that sense, he fits in very well with that group. At the same time, performance level within those games, he also fits Gibson and Hellebuck, who were obvious number ones in games played. And some people even throw out, well, what about like Vasilevsky, which is almost an outlier contract, at least at the time it was signed. It was way above other clear starters. So it's really a question of where does he fall in? Could Boston pay him at the level where he gets a John Gibson deal or even higher than that? So as an example, Gibson was a clear starter, played 60 games before his long-term deal. That was an 8-year contract, $6.4 million, which if you convert that to today's expected cap, or this offseason's expected cap of 87.7, you'd still be looking at an AAV at about 6.9, which is nowhere near what a lot of people are throwing out. 8 years by 8 by 8.5. They're thinking Vasilevsky. That's possible. He is very, very good 2 years straight and then has an amazing playoff run where, honestly, he carried Boston pretty much. So let's say he got 8 by 8. I'm not going to call it crazy. I'll call it an outlier because it's very tough to get to that level of a contract, even with comparable goalies who have played more games than he has to this point.
I think the projection we have makes a lot of sense, and it will basically put him on the Hellebuck schedule.
Yep.
Take him to right around 30, and then he can sign a monster contract at that point to basically finish out his career. To me, that makes complete sense. It also makes a lot of sense for Boston in that they don't have to lock up a ton of dollars in goaltending. They should still trade Ullmark, but if they could get Swayman on this type of contract, they don't have to.
Yeah.
But they could certainly go improve the roster in other areas, and I think, as you said, he took them as far as they went in the playoffs. They could use some more scoring punch, potentially another defenseman, and saving money on Swayman, but still getting 5 more years seems like an absolute no-brainer.
The other thing, so I 100% agree with that. And the other thing from a comparable standpoint, so this projected contract would fall underneath Gibson, Hellebuck. It would be above Shesterkin, Demko, Saros. He might fit from a games played standpoint a little more with Shesterkin, Demko. Performance-wise, a little bit more with Gibson, Hellebuck. Kind of make some sense for him to beat those low-end comps, but not quite get the contract that a clear number one starter would have. So I feel really good from a comparable standpoint about this projection, but I also just see the situation unfolding that, again, would I be shocked if he got a way bigger deal, an 8x8? It would surprise me a little bit. I wouldn't be shocked, but I would for sure consider it an outlier based on his sample size so far.
We won't spend any more time because this episode's already quite long. Yeah. The other kind of interesting restricted free agent is Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen in goal, at least with Buffalo. We'll maybe do a little bit more of an episode either on the Sabres or lower tier RFAs, UFAs, something like that in the future. But I think we're lengthwise, if you stuck this long, appreciate you listening. Again, we gave a teaser for kind of the next episode we have planned. So subscribe Max Turn Podcast on pretty much every single major podcast platform. On X, you can follow our content at AFP Analytics. We'll also let you know new episodes are posted there. Again, contract projections at AFP Analytics on X. Thoughts, anything like that, feel free to add us there as well, and we try to engage and respond the best we can. So we appreciate you listening, and we'll talk to you next time.